My name is Jon Jensen, and today I'm going to talk about some adventures that I've been on in Perl packaging. When I say Perl packaging, I'm talking about the packaging that comes with the operating system. Everything comes with Perl, pretty much, at least all the major Linux server OSs, and that's what I'm going to focus on here. Usually they come with some prepackaged CPAN modules, which is very convenient. For example, on Red Hat Enterprise Linux, or CentOS, or Scientific Linux, you can do a single command, yum install, and then a special format for naming a Perl dependency. In this case, it is for the CPAN module, the Perl module dbd::pg, and that's it. One command, it installs the right RPM, it installs any dependencies, both Perl ones and otherwise. So in this case, it's going to install DBI and PostgreSQL libs and anything else it needs. So that's very nice, and why wouldn't you use that? One thing I ought to note, this name some people don't know about. They might be looking for Perl-dbd-pg. That's what the RPM is called. But take, for example, http://date, and there is no RPM called that because it's part of LWP. And if you get in the habit of using the dependency name, you don't have to figure out what RPM that module is part of. You can just say, I want http date, and yum goes and finds the RPM that has that and installs it. So why would you want to install your CPAN modules this way? Well, it's predictable. For the lifetime of a given distribution, RHEL 5 or RHEL 6 or whatever it is, you're going to get the same version of that package, or at least the same API. It may have some bug fixes, some minor changes, but it's not going to break your code. Another thing that's nice is that the only dependency is the yum repository that you're getting the RPM from. And yum repositories are very easy to mirror, including locally on an internal network. So if you have lots of machines installing the same thing, you don't have to be dependent on the quality of mirrors that you may not be familiar with in the CPAN world, or just the speed of your public internet connection. You can mirror it locally. RPM and yum also prevent module incompatibilities. So if there's a few different modules that would install the same file in the same place, it's possible to have those in the same yum repository, but RPM will refuse to overwrite the one with the other. So that can stop certain problems from happening that you may not notice otherwise. Another nice thing is you can make your own RPM that is essentially a meta RPM that lists all of the different RPMs that you need. And then with one command, you can install that, and it will pull in everything that you need. And if you want to, you can specify particular versions, a certain version of dbd::pg, to use our earlier example. And you just say yum install and the package name that you made up, and it will go download and install everything. And it's very fast. If you need to roll back, it might even be rollbackable, but it might not. That's one of the less used features of yum, but it has worked in the few cases I've used it. I just think it's worth a caveat about that. So far so good, this is all great, but the biggest reason that people don't do what I've just described as a general rule is some CPAN module they need isn't there. In fact, the reputation that Red Hat Enterprise Linux and earlier Red Hat Linux had of not having very many CPAN modules isn't really deserved anymore. There's EPEL, which is a Fedora repository that stands for Extra Packages for Enterprise Linux, and it has a lot of CPAN modules prepackaged, and a lot of other useful things as well. And to leave the RPM space, I'll mention a few things about Debian, even though it's not my area of expertise. But Debian has a lot of CPAN modules prepackaged also. And the same advantages that I've mentioned about RPMs apply with dpackage and apt. However, having said that, saying it's a lot better now is still not the same as saying you'll never be missing a CPAN module. And it really only takes one. If you're in the middle of doing something and, oh, I just need this other CPAN module, and you go to install it with yum and it's not there, it ruins all the excitement that you had about this way of doing things because you're stuck. What do? There's a few other problems besides that one. What is the version of Perl that comes with the distribution you're using? And what are the versions of the various CPAN modules that you have installed? Maybe you need a newer version of one of the CPAN modules. It's just not going to be there. By definition, the way the packages are built, the repository needs to maintain stability for the lifetime of the repository, and so they're not generally going to put newer versions unless they're API compatible. This long-term support is the whole point of an enterprise distribution, so it doesn't really make sense to rail against it and complain about it. That's exactly what they're there for. And if you want unstable, you can use bleeding edge Ubuntu or Fedora or Arch Linux or Gentoo, like some people do, and that's fine. But the point of these enterprise distributions is the long-term support, so we need to figure out how to cope with that and not just be unhappy about it. So, the Perls can be really old. And just because Rahel 5 is still nice and used in production in a lot of places doesn't mean I'm going to be very happy to have to use Perl 5.8.8. And in fact, I will be dealing with Rahel 5 until at least 2017. And if you look at these other end-of-life dates, Ubuntu 12.04 is pretty recent. We'll be dealing with that till 2017. Rahel 6 only has 5.10.1, and in 2020 we'll see you there with Perl 5.10. That's a long time. So despite my apologies for the enterprise distribution's long-term support, this is still a problem for us, and it's getting worse. 5 years ago, the distributions were pretty current with the recent version of Perl, but since the annual release rhythm has come, the distributions aren't keeping up. And it's not just Linux. OpenBSD 5.3, released last month, includes Perl 5.12.2 for mysterious reasons. It's not even the most recent version of 5.12. So, but let's leave aside the old Perl for a minute and just talk about CPAN modules. Let's assume that the version of Perl that's in the distribution is okay, that you're willing to work with it, and you just need a few CPAN modules that they don't have packaged. What are your options? Well, you can learn how to build RPMs yourself. It is not the hardest thing in the world, especially for CPAN modules. There are some that are really a pain, and it is a bit of a black art. It's not the best documented process, but it's a lot better than it used to be. The Fedora project has really good documentation and a lot of people that are willing to help. If you build a CPAN module RPM that isn't in EPEL, for example, they'll likely be willing to accept it if you sign up and become a Fedora developer and contribute it. Or if you know that you're going to have modules that will not be accepted into EPEL or whatever other repositories you're talking about, you can make your own repository. It's not very hard. However, packaging is harder than not packaging, and it's a different skill set than your average Perl developer usually has. So it's popular to go with the quick and dirty option, which is to just use CPAN or CPAN-M and install from source. If you do that with the distribution Perl, it's generally a bad idea because the distribution Perl comes with a set of CPAN modules, and they may be used by distribution software. You can see, if you're curious, what packaged software uses Perl in your distribution with repo query for the Red Hat derivatives and apt cache for Debian and Ubuntu. And it's kind of interesting to see how many things depend on Perl in one way or another. So you're putting those things at risk if you just use CPAN to install from source against your distribution's Perl. Okay, the tried and true response to that is to go build your own Perl from source and install it into user local. That's simple, easy, and cheap right now. And if you're only ever going to have one server with one app, if you're keeping a very simple setup, then it's probably fine, to be honest. Some people would say, oh, that's not clean, it's not organized, how do you uninstall? But practically speaking, a lot of people do this, and it's okay. The problem is, you don't know at the beginning whether you're going to stay small or not. So it is worth thinking a little bit longer than that, because if you end up adding a lot of servers, this doesn't scale out very well. Or if you add more applications to the server and they end up needing different modules, you can't keep track of what did what. Installing from source also puts you at the mercy of the system libraries that happen to be on the system at the moment you're building. And some CPAN modules will make choices for you behind the scenes based on what's installed on the system. For example, an XML parser. If you don't have a certain XML parsing library on the system, it may just use a different method. It might do it in pure Perl. The behavior or the performance might be fairly different. You can see this with some of the SSL-based software. It might behave differently depending on whether you have GNU TLS or OpenSSL installed. More often than that, there may just be test failures because something isn't there, or build failures. And it does take longer. It's no big deal for one package, but when you go to set up a new machine, if you need to install hundreds of CPAN modules, it can take a while. If you have multiple servers, it's also tempting to think, well, whatever I did quick and dirty on the first server, I'll just do that on the others. But things that start the same don't easily stay the same. It can be difficult to remember what exactly did you do, or did you do anything at all, or there may be different people involved. A developer installs a CPAN module in a staging environment, forgets to tell system administrators to put it into production, and a lot of times this comes out while the site's down during a maintenance window and the clock's ticking. The other problem is, if you actually use the CPAN client to install from source on the fly, it's going to, by default, give you the latest version of every CPAN module you ask for, and you may get a newer version. And maybe that matters, and maybe it doesn't, or maybe it matters later when you use features in the older version that behave differently than the newer one weeks or months later. It can be really frustrating to track down these kind of problems. If you're using the same distribution, the same version, and the same architecture, 32 or 64-bit, then you can still get by with this kludge by just cloning user local. You can just treat one of them as the master and rsync it over to the others. Quick and dirty, but it does work. It's not uncommon for someone to then expect you to support the application on a different distribution, or to think that there's no difference between 32 and 64-bit, and then you discover you can't do that, and you have no way to recreate what you had. So, there's some recent technology, largely borrowed from the Ruby world, which is very nice. perlbrew and PLN both give you a way to custom install multiple versions of Perl from source, but in a managed way. You can switch between them. It brings a little bit of order to the chaos of a source build. And then Carton is a port of Ruby's bundler, which allows you to specify exactly which CPAN modules are being used in each of your applications to track that data in version control, and to specify the exact version if needed, or to not specify the version and let it update to newer versions for you. With Carton and PLN, you can even have a per project version of Perl that's different. If you have 5 projects on a machine, they can each be running a different Perl as well as different CPAN modules. Carton, if you're not familiar with it, it additionally has the nice benefit of hiding or only making available the CPAN modules that you have specified explicitly. So basically, when you run your app, if you don't list any CPAN modules, there are none at all. And that's a great boon because then you find out what's missing from your list of dependencies and you can go fill it in early during the development process. Carton also has an option to bundle tarballs of CPAN modules. And by doing that, you can remove the dependency on the public internet and the CPAN mirrors and downloading things. You've got everything you need, and you can either commit it into your source control system or have it out of band somewhere, but basically your own private CPAN with just what you need. But having said all that, you're still building on the fly. It's still slower. You still have to make sure that your machines have a full build environment, compiler, headers, any devel libraries that are needed. You may run into mysteriously failing tests at build time, or like I mentioned before, automatic decision making based on missing libraries that can lead to strange bugs. And if you're missing system libraries, this is I guess, an inception multi-layer problem, because if you install the missing system libraries out of source, then rather than from an RPM, then that's additionally not very well tracked. Did you keep track of your build arguments? Did you keep the exact source release that you used? And if you had multiple system libraries that needed to be built, did you keep track of the build order for the dependencies so that you're not having to go through trial and error during a maintenance window to install them over and over until they all work? And this is why RPM and dpackage were invented in the first place, is to handle this stuff. So, playing fast and loose works, and there's no doubt that you can make it work in a production environment. And I don't think it's a black or white, true or false kind of question, and to approach it that way is a little counterproductive. But I really think the building from source is better for desktop environments and experiments, and it's not really the best way to go for production environments. So, our story. We needed a newer Perl. We were using Rahel 5, and we had a lot of different machines. We also needed it to be built without threads for an application-specific reason. We needed it to live in parallel with the distribution Perl so that it wouldn't hurt anything in the OS that was already using Perl 5.8.8. And we wanted it to be repeatably, identically installable on many machines over time with really no institutional memory, with sysadmins not having to have a bunch of lore of how they did things. We also needed a lot of CPAN modules, and we didn't want the latest to always be installed without warning so that things would work. So we made our own Yum repositories. They live at packages.endpoint.com, and just based on when we started doing this, in Rahel 5 we were using Perl 5.10.0 and Rahel 6 5.14.1, and we've ended up having a lot of packages. We do consulting for our clients, mostly e-commerce and some other application development. And we found that when we shared the labor across all of these clients and the resulting packages built were shared, there's a lot there. And over a few years, you eventually come to the point where you do have most of the CPAN RPMs that you need. So, because the system Perl uses user bin Perl as the location for the binary, we couldn't use that, and we decided to use user local bin Perl. And according to Red Hat's package guidelines, and Debian's too, I believe, that's a mistake. We shouldn't have done that. we liked it because it was in the default path already, so it was easy to get to. And once we had this all done, our meta RPM that listed all the dependencies would automatically pull in this local Perl, and everything would just work. We did have to change the Shebang Line at the beginning of scripts to point to user local bin Perl, but that was basically the only manual labor involved. Except for all the labor I'm not mentioning yet. So setting up a Yum repository involves creating a repo, which is really easy, hosting it somewhere, easy, make a GNU PG signing key pair, and then distribute the secret and public key part securely to your trusted team members who are working on this. You need a build server, little VM will do. You need a build user because you don't do package building as root. You need to set up a .rpm macros file in the home directory, and that's where you specify a lot of things, including where you're going to build, if you're going to sign the packages, which I recommend sign them with GPG, the name of the packager, the key name for GPG, and then we have a whole bunch of other things in here that are redefining certain RPM macros so that these builds would work with our user local version of Perl that has the strange name of local-Perl instead of just Perl. So most of these, if you look at, there's Perl provides, these are redefining some helpers for RPM for finding provides and requires. And then the prefix says that this all lives in user local, and the rest of that whole stanza is just built off of the prefix. And then the last one is a macro that says where does the Perl binary live. So once you have that set up, you're ready to build some kind of RPM, but you also need to make spec files. And spec files are the RPM way of saying how to build the thing you're building. We use a helper called CPAN to RPM, and we customized it to use our local Perl and our non-standard naming convention. There are some other options. CPAN spec is the one that the Fedora project uses, and thus Red Hat Enterprise Linux does as well. It's probably your best default choice if you're going to do this nowadays. And there's one called CPAN to dist, which is part of CPAN Plus, which I haven't used. I mentioned earlier that RPM can automatically pull in dependencies that are needed of other Perl, other CPAN modules. It also has to know what each package provides. That's how we were able to say, please install HTTP date, and it goes and grabs LWP. It's because the RPM package specifies that it provides HTTP date and a whole bunch of other things. Well, the automatic dependency finders are surprisingly glorious hacks that are mostly grep, and so they make mistakes. If you have CPAN modules that do any runtime requires or any string munging to create a package name, it's very easy for CPAN to RPM to be fooled. Most often, you will just miss dependencies that way, and it's easy to tell CPAN to RPM, oh, add this dependency that you didn't notice, so that's fine. It can also accidentally find things that could be used depending on the system that you're running on, such as Win32 stuff on Linux, which I don't want RPM to say that I need, but it finds it and thinks it needs it anyway. And then there are some modules that bundle some bootstrapping extra CPAN modules in their entirety in the inc path, and CPAN to RPM will often find those and think that it's providing those packages as well, even though it isn't. That's a very easy thing to exclude. So those are the kind of problems you run into when you're using the CPAN to RPM and creating a spec file. Usually it works okay. I mention these things because they do come up, but you might build 20 or 30 or 50 packages before you run into any trouble. So works pretty well. Now, back to my earlier note about actually building a custom Perl. What we did for that was pretty straightforward. We were happy enough with the way Red Hat built Perl We just wanted it to live somewhere else and not have threading enabled. So we took Red Hat's source RPM and just modified it to use the local Perl location, the custom invocation of configure, and you can make whatever other changes you want to that, and then you go build it, and you're done. That one can be a little tricky, but you only pay that cost once, so it's not as stressful, I find. Now, you do have to do all of this for each distribution, for example, RHEL 4, 5, or 6, and each architecture of i386 or x86-64. We decided for RHEL 6, let's just not use 32-bit at all, and that saved us a lot of trouble. You could automate trying to rebuild the output source RPM on the other architecture, but some of the problems that come up in RPM building have to do with the architecture, so that's as likely to not happen automatically as it is to work. If you've used other Yum repositories, you may have encountered there's a couple of ways that people will say that you can start using their Yum repo. One way is to just drop a configuration file into etc yum.repos.d, and it's a .repo file, and it just specifies the URL, the name of it, and a few other configuration parameters. A few Yum repositories out there have a practice that I like. They actually create an RPM for supporting their Yum repository, and this RPM will install that yum.repos.d configuration file. It will also load up the GPG signing key so that you're all ready to go. And the best thing is, it gives you the other benefits of packaged software. You can easily uninstall that repository as easily as you installed it. And later, if for some reason the repository needs to move, the repository maintainers can actually release an updated version of this RPM, and when you go to do a Yum upgrade with it, you will get the new version of their repository settings, which bootstraps you to the new way of getting to their software. So, I mentioned earlier, things that we could do better starts with installing into user local. That's really supposed to be the place to just do source installs, and that wasn't the best choice. Seemed good at the time. Another thing was, in the RPM building world, there's a tool called mock, which sets up a chrooted environment for building RPMs cleanly from scratch with a minimal environment, so that you don't accidentally have unknown dependencies on your build system. We didn't use mock long ago when we started with RHEL 4, and we just kept doing things the same way. Now we would definitely use mock, and we plan to do that when RHEL 7 comes out. So, not dealing with user local bin Perl, which is in path. Well, you could use the alternative system, which RHEL borrowed from Debian. That's a possibility. You could use a different name. EPEL did this when they added support for Python 2.6 to live alongside Python 2.4 on Red Hat Enterprise Linux 5. That way you just have to invoke Python 2.6, but it still lives in user bin, and the libraries live in user lib, and so they're just different names. That's an option too. Another way is to just install things into opt. It's really what opt was designed for, is this kind of third-party packaged software. Then you just have to add your strange opt path to your path, and the other benefit of that is if you label things well, you can install multiple versions of Perl in parallel on the same system, which with our user local setup didn't work. A quick note about the Shebang Line. It's getting more common and it's attractive in a lot of ways to use binenv in your Shebang Line and say binenv Perl. I think that's a nice thing to do when you're just distributing software through GitHub or whatever. I don't like to use that in production anymore because I've run into some problems with it. path can be a little bit slippery when you have different shells doing different things when they get initialized. And just this last week, for example, we ran into a problem of a program that re-execs itself, and it did successfully re-exec itself. Everything, all the paths were correct in the invocation, but the shell blew away the path customization so that only user bin and bin existed. And none of those are a problem if you use a shebang line that points directly to the Perl that you really want. That's definitely going to be the most robust way. You can also use wrapper scripts or shims to have little shell scripts that set things up exactly like you want every time. So in recent, I don't know how old it is, but it only came to my attention sometime in the last 6 months or so. Red Hat has started doing something called Red Hat Software Collections. They recognize the pain of using an ancient version of PHP or Python or Perl in RHEL 5, and they want to make that distribution that's supported for so long be somewhat more pleasant to use into its old age. Red Hat Software Collections packages a whole bunch of new things. They live in a different namespace, they don't conflict with the system packages, and they basically do everything I just described here. So, for example, on Red Hat Enterprise Linux 6, instead of Perl 5.10.1, you can also have Perl 5.16.3 installed in opt.rh Perl 5.16, and it has lots of CPAN modules prepackaged and ready to go. And if Red Hat's build of Perl is fine, if you don't have a weird requirement like we did to have an unthreaded Perl, then this is a great option that I can recommend. They're still calling it a beta, and I'm not sure why. It may just be new enough that they don't have a lot of feedback yet from people. But it seems pretty reliable and well done. It's a nice approach to a lot of the things I've been talking about. And if Red Hat Software Collections has everything you need in Perl but that one module, then you may well be able to contribute that and have that show up, or maybe into EPEL or something like that. But it means that community's working the way it should. We're spreading the work around. On the other hand, there will be situations like ours with the unthreaded Perl that are just strange, and it's very unlikely Red Hat is going to be interested in a strange configuration like that. So we're going to be on our own, and there will always be a case for having your own Yum repository in certain circumstances. Another reason is just you may need a way to distribute your one weird CPAN RPM now, and it could take days to go through the process of getting approved in a third-party repository. RPMs, all the things I've talked about, still don't provide a way to have multiple versions of the same CPAN module installed at the same time. Now, you can work around that by forcing your newer version to install in a different place in the Inc path, like site-perl. We've run into problems with newer software requiring newer versions of module build or syslog, and those are in the core, and you can't build a newer RPM that will replace just that part of the core Perl build. So that's a real pain. It's a showstopper if you don't figure out a way around it. Having one of them install into site-perl works, but you are taking some risk there if the API changes that you might be breaking something else. So it's got to be well tested. So, impatience. A certain luminary present at this conference has told us that that's a virtue for programmers. Is it? Will you ever really be able to package CPAN modules in RPMs fast enough to meet the impatience standards of developers? No. Really, I don't think developers will be satisfied, and when I'm wearing a developer hat, that's me too, unless I can just type CPAN-M, package name, and walk away happy. You really need to let developers do that somewhere, just not in the production machine, but in a development machine Give them local lib, show them how to install packages from CPAN into their home directory, because a lot of times they don't even know what package they want yet, and it's silly to have system administrators or packagers going out and building huge piles of RPMs that developers aren't even sure they're going to need. So there's definitely, like I said, a place in the development world for just building things from source in a throwaway location. Save the RPM packaging for when it's really worthwhile. Software's hard, and packaging software is also software, so it's also hard. And it's a crossover discipline, so that's why kind of corny neologisms like DevOps are coined. It's a combination of skill sets, and not every developer is going to want to package RPMs, and they shouldn't. But usually you can find some on a team of more than 2 or 3 people, somebody who's willing to learn how to do this, and maybe they can help their system administrator learn how to do it also. Business software is about more than just writing code and doing cool stuff. It's about making a service available, so it's really worth worrying about this stuff. My ideal situation isn't yet possible as far as I know, but I would love to see Carton have the ability to fake the kind of blank slate on a system that it does normally, even if certain RPMs are installed. Basically, to have Carton be able to see RPM installed modules and manage them. We've done a little experimenting with that at Endpoint, and we haven't yet succeeded, but I think it's worth trying more later. Among other things, it would be really neat to have most of your CPAN modules installed as RPMs, and then as a developer to say to Carton, yeah, I want to try these other ones out, and it goes and installs them from source into the home directory, and then have it tell me, okay, here's what you're using that isn't RPM packaged. Go send this list to your system administrator and get them built. It'd be a nice hybrid with some of the best of both worlds. Like I mentioned, Red Hat Software Collections deals with the same problem in Python, Ruby, and PHP. These aren't unique problems to Perl, but as we've seen from Carton and PLN, there's some learning that can happen back and forth between the communities, which is helpful. If you're interested in learning how to do any of this, I've got a bunch of references with links that'll be is online already at jon.endpoint.com, so you can follow the links and read more about it. There was a good talk at YAPCNA just this year on building Perl RPMs. He goes into more detail about RPM building itself, so if you're new to that, that's a good place to start. There's CPAN RPMs in Rahel sent to us. That talks about problems installing a newer version of a core module. There are some other people's CPAN RPM repositories that may be useful. Some references to Carton, PLN, and perlbrew, and then a few other things out on the edges that might be interesting to you as well. So, anyone have any questions? Yes.
Okay. What about FreeBSD?
What about what?
FreeBSD systems and another system.
I don't know about FreeBSD. OpenBSD I've used more, and its packages system.
Yes, it's cool. But it's not so
it has basically the same problems. You'll have compatibility problems. You would have to learn how to make your own if you're not happy with what's there. I guess I can still talk into this, even though he's not on a mic.
But FreeBSD have much more packages for Perl.
Audience member said FreeBSD has many more packages, but yes, but remember, it just takes one missing, and then you break your regime of doing it the right way, or the way you plan to do it anyway. Other questions?
I'm sorry, can you give an example where when you don't need trees into any simple example, so we can understand why you need such things?
I've probably the best example is if you install by CPAN DBI on a development machine, and 3 years later you set up a new production machine and you say CPAN DBI, it's going to install a totally different version. it'll grab the latest version. So that's a big reason. Another reason is just the library problem, dependency tracking. For example, if you're going to do anything with SSL or TLS, you need devel libraries installed for those. So it's really all the reasons that the distributions ship packages in the first place, rather than just dumping a bunch of files on a system.
I think you misheard the question.
Oh, sorry, correct me.
The question was, why would you need Perl without threads?
Oh, Perl without threads. That's a long story. It just didn't work right with a particular combination of old software. It's that same software is fine with threads now, so it's not a problem anymore. And threading used to be slower, so not by much. But anyone else got a question I can misunderstand? Sorry. Okay, thank you.